The moon, in all her glory, was dying. Even those who knew nothing of the corruption could sense her decline. She had taken on a sickly glow that cast a light of dread and misfortune on New Orleans. The ignorant and the innocent could do nothing but look up at the source of that disquieting light with reverence and growing trepidation. Those untouched by the moon's first assault were beginning to turn. Panic began to spread, and alongside it came despair, exposing more hearts to the devastation of her pallid effervescence. O Night's Eye, mother of twilight and tide, could your steady pulse fall still? Could your light be dimmed and put out? Those who knew of the corruption were recruited to end the tragedy. Hunters from all walks of life and faith gathered behind Mr. Sherry, hoping that in helping him solve his problems, they might also solve their own. But hope is a slippery thing, easily corrupted. Kevin Linus watched from the window of his home by the pond and the willow. Outside, Mr. Sherry waited beside the circle he had drawn in the dirt on so many moonlit nights before. He would not have to wait long. We're all slaves to habit and desire in the end. The sound of her footsteps preceded her grim silhouette, and Mary Ochankov walked straight into the circle without hesitation or greeting. The dirty, dripping bag in her hands began to burn first. Her clothes quickly followed, and as the screams began again, Kevin wept. He would scream with her, would share her pain, and stop the terrible cycle. But though he tried, no sound escaped his mouth. As the flames grew, twisting their way around Mary's neck, she suddenly snapped her head toward Kevin, a knowing, accusatory expression on her face, while Mr. Sherry looked on in sadistic glee. Mary crossed the ritual markings, sparks erupting where they broke, and ran toward the house. When she reached the door, she screamed and tore at the panels until her nails broke and bled. "Why didn't you help me?" she wailed. And then he woke up. All the encounters had been the same. The chase, the trails of blood, the confrontation and the defeat. As cyclical and constant as the moon. The only thing that had changed were the snakes. Kevin Linus had been pursuing Mr. Orwell Sherry for weeks across southern Louisiana. From New Orleans to Baton Rouge and back, the boy had followed the AHA administrator's trail, his focus interrupted only by the hunter assassins Mr. Sherry hired to stop him. But the moon had been gracious in her blessing, and Kevin had gained an otherworldly intuition for gunplay and combat. All went back to Mr. Sherry, unable to hunt. He finally cornered Mr. Sherry in Ascension Parish. My, how you've grown," Mr. Sherry said as he spread his arms in mock welcome. His 3 hunter companions kept their guns warily trained on the boy. "Haven't you done enough?" Kevin replied, pointing his pistol at Mr. Sherry's head. But all the man did was smile. "Young man, you're in my way." At that, Mr. Sherry snapped his fingers, and a shot rang out into the night. Kevin looked down to see a red blossom blooming from a hole in his stomach. He looked up, and a second shot rang out. Kevin fell to his knees as he clutched his bloody stomach with a keening wail. "What a wonderful sound," Mr. Sherry said. "Truly fitting that it's the last thing anyone will hear from you." Mr. Sherry walked over to the boy and kicked him onto his back. Tears welled in Kevin's eyes as he groaned and convulsed. But when he moved his hands to expose the bullet wound, he found it had transformed from bloody blossom to writhing vista of protrusions and pulsing sores. And then, a snake slithered from his bloody sleeve. The snake was small, milky-eyed and covered in the blood and viscera of Kevin's flesh. Kevin ripped at the shirt, widening the tear to reveal a coiled brood of small snakes nested in the wound, as if just hatched scaly maggots uncoiling themselves from his flesh. For 2 agonizing hours, Mr. Orwell Sherry kneeled over the boy's body, tearing and slicing at Kevin's flesh as he moaned in tired agony. "What's happening?" Kevin asked. The question was met with silence and another incision. From the fresh, gaping wound, Mr. Sherry plucked the body of a snake. Again and again, Mr. Sherry pulled the snake from the wound. Again and again, the animals sunk their venomous fangs into his hands. It was just what Mr. Sherry needed. And with each overwhelming, nauseating rush, he thrust his hands deeper into the wound, probing for more. The largest snake came from the final incision, a bloody, jagged line from hip to heart. Mr. Sherry's assistants struggled to force it into a bag, and as it writhed, too powerful even for 3 hulking men, it clamped its jaws around the ankle of the tallest hunter. It provided him no rush, rather leaving its victim paralyzed and helpless, silent witness to Mr. Sherry's administrations. Was this really what they were fighting for? To allow this man to torture an innocent boy? "Thank you, Kevin," Mr. Sherry whispered. "You've earned my mercy." The administrator drew close, holding his gun to the boy's temple. He caressed the trigger, savoring the moment. Kevin looked to the moon and back to Mr. Sherry. With his last strength, he twisted his body and sunk his teeth into the man's wrist. Deep in Kingsnake Mine, Isaac Powell, known to most only as the Night Seer, watched Ira Ozol's weaving. Strips of dried flesh dipped in rosemary oil, willow splints and straw combined to form the shape of a large basket-like structure. Oil dripped from its plaits, and footsteps echoed from the direction of the nearest mine shaft. The flickering lamp was disturbed by a faint breeze, and the shadows danced as Mr. Sherry entered the dark cavern. He regarded Ira's work and nodded. He then turned to acknowledge the imposing hooded hunter who sat in the corner, gently stroking the head of the enormous snake coiled around their neck. "Isaac, you didn't tell me you had already met." Mr. Sherry regarded the figure in the corner with respect. "A rare occurrence." "He keeps to himself," came the gruff reply. The figure rose and turned towards the Night Seer, menacing. Isaac, I believe they would rather not be addressed as he, returned the administrator. The Viper is a valued guest. Show some respect. At this, the Viper stepped into the swaying light of the lamp. They were dressed simply, practically, feet bare and undisturbed by the rocky floor. The large snake coiled around their neck lifted its head, appraising the two men. The Night Seer cautiously nodded. My apologies, Isaac said. We haven't had the opportunity to exchange many pleasantries. I was surprised to find the sinners were already involved. I've been looking for someone fit to the task for a long time. The sinners sent the Viper, and Mr. Sherry looked to the Viper to provide the name of the snake.
Delara,
came the Viper's response, their voice the rough whisper of a person who does not often speak. At the final syllable, the snake adjusted itself around the Viper's throat. Mr. Sherry nodded, then spoke again. It's time for the night of the hunters and the sinners to bury their quarrels. We need to work together, much as that pains us both. You think Finch would like hearing you say that? Powell scoffed. Isaac, you know I believe in your vision, but I must maintain my position with Finch until the time is right. Something dangerous glinted in Mr. Sherry's eyes as he spoke. Isaac grunted. But politics aside, this is why we're here. Mr. Sherry raised his arm, and a snake silently slithered from his sleeve. There's a new breed, already adults after only a few days, exquisite venom, and so hungry. Mr. Sherry paused, before looking between Isaac and Viper. Simply insatiable. It was unclear if he was referring to the snake or himself. He smiled. Ira Azal's mother had taught her to weave baskets, and she still found comfort in the repetition of the work, now seeking distraction from thoughts about what she would be asked to do. The Night Seer had trusted her with the task, much to the chagrin of Nadia, his most loyal acolyte. As the others argued and planned, Ira wondered about the relationship between Mr. Sherry and the Night Seer. Who was exploiting who? But she didn't really care. It was the Night Seer's vision that interested her. Until she found herself left alone with Mr. Sherry. He spoke. Ira, it's so nice to see you again. And with Mr. Powell, no less. Mr. Sherry's whisper set the night follower's skin on edge. She suppressed a shiver. Where Isaac goes, I follow, Ira responded firmly. The administrator smiled. I see he trusts you, said Mr. Sherry, intimately. He paused at that. We have a common goal. Almost finished with the structure, she began to check for unintentional gaps. And what goal is that? The administrator asked. You said you believed his vision. I heard you. I wouldn't think you needed to ask. Isaac Powell had told all of his acolytes what he'd seen. But Ira felt that something was missing, that he had kept something from them too terrible or too important to share freely. Mr. Sherry kneeled beside the altar and spoke. I see he didn't trust you enough to tell you either. Well, what if I told you I knew how to find out? He stood and offered her a hand. Come with me. Perhaps I can show you. With just a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord, your God, will be with you wherever you go. Mary Burgess spoke the words into the stock of her Wetterly before looking to her partner. Cersei Elias looked back at her and murmured a quick amen before moving forward into the night. Cersei wasn't exactly religious, but with the mission ahead of them, any help, divine or otherwise, would be welcome. The moon was full and bright, and they moved slowly and surely. Mr. Sherry had introduced the two women after they had accepted his contract. Mary was easy to convince. The bayou was full of sin, and Mr. Sherry was a servant of the Lord. If there was someone after the administrator's life, then she would ask God for forgiveness and do what had to be done. Cersei was more difficult to convince. She was single-minded in her pursuit of the creature that had murdered her sister and stolen her skin. And as the last heiress of the Elias fortune, she did not care about gold or glory. Mr. Sherry used an old trinket, a locket with a portrait of Cersei's family, to earn a favor from the witch hunter. As Cersei and Mary threaded their way through the bayou, they ignored the familiar moans and shrieks of the grunts and hives that stumbled through the night, and the rustle of the armored's papery casing. But what caught their attention was a soft whimpering, human and suffering, from within a half-collapsed shack, camouflaged by rotten clumps of netting and earth. Cersei nodded at Mary, and they readied their weapons. This was the place, and their quarry clearly injured. They'd be done in time to take morning communion.